So I'm here today with more science fiction and fantasy reviews. Especially, I have a lot of new releases, particularly those that are in series. So I have sequels, I have companion novellas, I have spin-off series, and whenever I read these type of books, it always makes me wonder, basically, why were they written, why were they published, do they add to the overall series, or are they just a big old marketing grab? Some of these books are fantastic and definitely worth your time, but some of them maybe are not. Let's discuss and get started. First, let's talk science fiction, starting with Unconquerable Sun by Kate Elliott, along with its sequel book, Furious Heaven. This is the one that's a new release, but I went back and started at the beginning because I've never read it before. This is a space opera story that is compared to be a gender swap version of Alexander the Great. And like every other reader who has marketed and reviewed this book, I have to say that I have no idea where that comparison comes from. I just don't know enough about history that it wasn't really obvious reading it. That being said, this is a story that follows a young woman named Sun who is in line for the throne of her world. However, there are those that want her to not necessarily succeed in that role, and instead they want to take her down and possibly kill her. So right at the beginning of the first book, she goes on the run with other people that she is kind of reluctant to pair up with, and the story spirals from there. I will say that this first book, and all of this applies to the second book as well, was really fun to read. It was very fast-paced and action-packed. It was fun and enjoyable. But as I found often with Kate Elliott's work, it wasn't necessarily the most memorable. And so I recently finished reading the first book and then went on to the second, and I realized how little of the first book I really remembered, and it was not because I was rushing through the book, it just simply did not leave an impact on me. I remember the general gist of events, but while I think she's a very good storyteller, I don't think that she writes stories, at least the ones I've read so far, I don't find them to be particularly earth-shattering or moving. So if you're someone who is looking to have a good time with a space opera story, this is one I would recommend. However, if you're looking for a book that is going to become an all-time favorite, one that is really going to stay with you and just leave you thinking about it long after you finished, at least for me, I didn't get that experience with this series. I think she's a really good storyteller, but I'll be honest, I felt like there was something a little bit missing that really gave this book heart. Instead, it was just a fly by the seat of your pants, really fast read. And there is at least one more book coming. I'm not sure if I'll continue, just because I know that by the time that one comes out, my memory and experience with this one would have faded, and so I'm not sure if I'm going to be pulled to continue on, even though there definitely is more story to tell. Next is Antimatter Blues by Edward Ashton. This is a follow-up book to Mickey 7. So in the first book, which I read and reviewed last year, really enjoyed, we follow a man who works in a job where he is disposable. Essentially, he goes and does really dangerous jobs, and if he dies, it's okay because they just take his memories and put it into another version of himself. And so I really like this one. It plays a lot with the idea of like cloning and just how disposable we are as employees. So I thought it was really topical, really fun. And so because I enjoyed the first book so much, I was excited when a second book was being published, and that's this one here. I will let you know that you do want to start back with the first book if you're going to check out this one, because it does absolutely spoil the events of what happens there. And I do think you're going to get a lot more out of the story if you're already invested with the characters. And while I enjoyed reading the second one, it was once again funny, lighthearted, and just an enjoyable time. I do find myself wondering if this book was necessary. I do tend to personally prefer continuing on with series when there is more of a hook, and because this one is very slice of life, very fun, it just never really felt like the stakes were that high. And so because of it, I definitely could have left Mickey 7 as a standalone. I think it works perfectly that way. This one is just simply there if you want to continue on and spend more time with the characters, but I'm not usually that type of reader, so I liked it. But could I have not read it and still had a good time and still be happy with my experience with the first book? Absolutely. So I'd only recommend this one to die-hard fans of the first that want even more in the world. Next up, let's talk about the Imperial Raditz trilogy, which starts with Ancillary Justice. I've actually read this book before, and I haven't read it recently since, because I've read it 3 times at this point. But I read it last year with my book club and always meant to continue on, so I finally did that. So I read Ancillary Sword and Ancillary Mercy. Now, if you've heard my gushing reviews of the first book, it's a story involving this entity who is the intelligence for the ship. Normally they they are in the presence of a whole bunch of different bodies. However, at the time that we meet them in this first book, they are only in one body. And so I love that the story explores some really interesting ideas surrounding artificial intelligence, and also it has some really overarching, interesting themes surrounding colonialism, because this artificial intelligence works within a nation or this entity that takes over other planets and bends them to their will. And so I love this first book. It's one of revenge. It's dark and strange and very distinct. And so I have technically read these last two books before, but they are such a different shift in tone that I'll be honest, I didn't really like them the first time. Now when I went to reread them, I was aware that there's a tone shift and actually really enjoyed them. I would primarily recommend this series to those of you that love things along the lines of the Machineries of Empire trilogy by Yoon-Hae Lee, because while I love those ones, I fully admit that they kind of have a weird, quirky tone and they almost get a little bit silly in places, and that's how I feel about these later two books. So despite the fact that the first book deals with some incredibly heavy, dark themes, those themes continue into these later books, but somehow the author twists them around and makes this really cozy story. So you spend time with the characters, they're drinking tea, you find out what they eat for breakfast, and people have described this as a piece of Jane Austen literature that's been turned into science fiction. And I completely see that. It's very character driven, it has some really smart political themes that are discussed, but it's also incredibly cute and cozy. And like I said, I remember reading this the first time and being completely upset because it was such a shift from the first book. Now I reread it and really appreciate it for what it is. I think it's so unique, it's so different, and I definitely can see why people compare this author to C.J. Cherryh, who I'm also starting to really love. So anyway, I do recommend continuing on with this series, but you have to be prepared that there's a giant shift in tone, and it's not going to be for everyone, but it definitely was for me. Next, let's switch over to fantasy, starting with Night Angel Nemesis by Brent Weeks. This is a book that I received for review from Orbit, and yes, they are returning to the world of the Night Angel, which I've previously gushed about and reviewed. I really enjoyed the original trilogy, even though I fully acknowledge it has its flaws. Essentially, this is assassin fantasy, and in this one, it is a start to a new series, but it definitely picks up after the events of the last one, following similar characters. So I don't want to spoil anything about the plot or give away too much of kind of who's in here, because I feel like that spoils who lives and dies in the previous books and all that. But I will say that if you are interested in the series, you do have to start back at the original trilogy, which I mentioned people do have criticisms about, and I feel like Brent Weeks did listen to those vocal criticisms in this one. So one thing that people don't love is the fact that there's a lot of male gaze in his series. He doesn't write the most wonderfully rounded out female characters, and I feel like he really backed away from some of the things that have turned off other readers. But at the same time, he continues to do what he does great. There is so much witty banter, great humor, and he writes just fantastic action. I love his action, and I'm not someone who gushes about action in fantasy. I'll admit I'm much more of a character reader, and definitely the characters are well developed in this one. I really enjoyed spending time with these characters, which once again I was introduced to in the last series, and spending time with them again was really enjoyable. And then on top of that, I fully acknowledge that I feel like Brent Weeks has grown a lot as a writer since his original trilogy, because yes, I have read his other series, The Lightbringer, and in terms of the prose, this reminds me a lot more of the later books in that series. So if you found The Night Angel to be a little bit more of a debut, a little bit weaker in places, I think you'll be very pleased with where this one goes. The story was enjoyable. However, I do need to admit that while I had a great time reading it, and I really did, however, I do acknowledge that when I finished this book, I did wonder why it was chosen to be written. I wonder if this is a bit in response to the fact that a lot of people, including myself to a degree, feel like the ending to the first Night Angel trilogy was a little bit weak, and so he wanted to continue on and give it another go. But in terms of the scope of the story, the stakes just weren't as high as I would have liked them to be. In a lot of ways, it felt like spending just time with the characters. There's again a lot of goofy moments and things that just made it feel fun to be with the characters, but not necessarily necessary to have a whole another series started. So will I read more in this series? Absolutely. I want more books to come. I'm really excited to be back here. I do recommend, again, starting back at the beginning. Even if you don't think the first books are perfect, you will get so much more out of this one. But if you love Night Angel, you do want to continue on. It's just really enjoyable, really fun, and I really do find myself liking Brent Weeks' writing a lot. I would love to see what else he does after this. And next, we have Spring's Arcana by Lilith Saintcrow. This is another book I received for review from the publisher, and this is a piece of urban fantasy that is compared to American gods as well as Baba Yaga. And in the story, we follow a young woman whose mother is very very sick and she's very desperate to help her, and so she ends up kind of reaching out to the universe and gets pulled into this portal. So this is in a way a piece of portal fantasy, but in terms of the fantastical elements, I was very underwhelmed by them. I wanted this book to be a bit more magical. Instead, it felt very grounded in this world in a way that I found unsatisfying. And I think that's mostly because the fact when it comes to more contemporary or portal fantasy is that, for my opinion, it's very dependent on having very interesting, likable characters. And not that the character was unlikable, I just had zero attachment to her or them, and I kind of found the book to be quite flat. I didn't think the writing was special, and that basically is what this comes down to, is that I don't think this book brought anything special. I believe it's the first book in a duology, and I'll be honest, I have no interest in continuing. I was very disappointed. I thought this one would be really exciting, and it was a very forgettable read. Next is The Way Home by Peter S. Beagle, another book that I received for review. And this is a collection of 2 novellas that takes place in the universe of The Last Unicorn, which is a standalone epic fantasy, and one that I absolutely love. I'm obsessed with the movie. I watched it so many times since being a child, and I've also read the book and now love that. And so I was very eager to continue on. I am admittedly kind of hit or miss when it comes to these companion novellas, because I'm always wondering whether or not they're actually going to add something to the world. So what I can say without spoiling anything is that the perspectives they chose in this novella as the main perspective surprised me, because it was introducing some new characters that I wasn't already attached to. And so I was a little bit disappointed. I would have loved to have stories told from the villains' perspectives in The Last Unicorn, but admittedly, I just really love villains. I would love to get more of their backstory and how they came to be. So that's what I was hoping these stories would be. But I still enjoyed getting to spend time with the characters. We got introduced to some of the main characters from the book, and it was great to see them even from the outside. And so I liked these ones, the first story a little bit more than the second, but unfortunately I just don't think it was up to the caliber of the original work. So I would only recommend this to diehard fans that want to spend more time in the world. But if I'm honest, it wasn't completely as satisfying as I hoped it would be. I am much more likely to just reread the original story rather than reread this collection. And finally, for fantasy, let's talk about the Witcher books. I got the collection of the first 3 for Christmas and then continued on. And so I'm caught up now and completed all of the full-length novels in the series. This is a series that I've read parts of it before, and I'm now finally coming back to read all of it, because I really do want to make sure I'm completing series that I'm starting if I enjoyed them enough to continue. I fully admit with this series that a lot of my love for it comes from the Netflix adaptation, which I realize is not a very true adaptation. They made a lot of changes. Unfortunately, I like a lot of those changes. I like some of the choices they made, even if they are not true to the original material, which is a bad thing to say. Also, I do love the video games, which, while they are reminiscent of the original materials, they again make artistic licensing changes. And I first was introduced to the video game and then to the TV show before reading a lot of the books. So I feel heavily biased that I experienced the story or the world in the wrong order. So I admit that I enjoyed parts of these stories, but other parts I did not. There are some strange choices, some narrative places they go that I didn't really understand why they chose to do that. There definitely is a lot more focus on Ciri in the story, which I didn't mind. I've heard people warn that if you just want non-stop Geralt, like in the video game, you're not going to get that. And I didn't mind it. I definitely saw the overarching theme, and really that she was supposed to be a main focal point in the narrative. I loved the Eastern European influences within the story, the idea of tying things to kind of fairy tales. And there's a lot I've appreciated, but I didn't entirely love the writing, which I know is always frustrating to say in a translation, because you never know what the original writing was like, or if that got kind of muddled through getting translated to English. So overall, I like this one, but I'll be honest, when I redo and update my favorite fantasy series of all time, I don't think this is going to make the list, because there was too many things that I didn't love about it, and there are other series I just think do it better. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know, of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I'd also love to hear, what is a series that you would love to see with a companion book or a spin-off series? Even if the author is no longer writing today, I would love to know, in your perfect hypothetical world, what book would you love to see bring another series back to life with? If you're interested in subscribing, I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy. You can also help me out with this video here by giving me a thumbs up. You can drop a comment, even if it's just a little emoji like a dragon or a spaceship. All that helps me out. And if you want to hit that little notification bell, you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.